Picture a person sitting alone in a quiet room for one full hour. No phone, no television, nobody needing anything from them. For some people, that's the most restorative hour of their week. For others, that same hour is close to unbearable. Not because anything's wrong in the room, but because the moment the noise outside stops, the noise inside gets louder. And here's the part almost nobody wants to admit out loud. When a person can't tolerate that internal noise, they don't usually just suffer through it quietly. They find a way to make the outside world loud again, and whoever's closest to them pays for it. This is Robbin, and this is the Honest Ledger. Today, we're opening the books on a pattern that shows up in a lot of relationships and rarely gets named correctly. Manufactured urgency as an escape hatch from internal discomfort, and what it actually costs the partner who is just trying to come home to some peace. One thing needs to be said clearly before we get into it, and I'll only say it once. This isn't a pattern that belongs to one gender. The instinct to avoid sitting with your own uncomfortable thoughts by generating external noise instead shows up in men and women both. Plenty of men do this too, through work, through scrolling, through picking fights of their own. What we're diagnosing here is a specific psychological pattern, not a claim about how an entire gender's mind works. Whoever's doing it in your relationship, the mechanism and the cost are the same. Let's open the ledger. The first entry in the ledger is what peace is actually worth to the person receiving it, because you can't understand what's being lost here until you understand what was supposed to be there. For a lot of people, home is supposed to be the one place where nothing is required of them. No performance, no vigilance, no bracing for the next thing that needs handling. When that's actually available, it does something real. The nervous system settles, the day gets processed. Whatever got activated at work or out in the world has somewhere to land and dissolve. Picture a man who's had a genuinely hard week, who finally gets one quiet evening at home, and who can feel himself exhale for the first time in days. That exhale is not a small thing. It's the entire function that home is supposed to serve, and a relationship that consistently fails to provide it stops being a place of restoration and starts being just another site of vigilance. On the ledger, an evening's worth of peace, worth far more than it looks like from the outside, because it's the thing that lets a person actually recover instead of just power through. And this matters for both people in the relationship, not just the one who benefits most visibly from it. A household where nobody ever gets to fully exhale produces two depleted people eventually, even if only one of them is the one losing sleep over it. The second entry is the psychology behind why some people can't tolerate stillness in the first place. And there's real research behind this, not just an observation. A well-known study published in the journal Science had participants sit alone in a room with literally nothing to do but think, for periods as short as 6 to 15 minutes, and found that a striking number of people found the experience so uncomfortable that, given the option, a meaningful portion of participants, men included, chose to give themselves a mild electric shock rather than sit with their own thoughts in silence. That finding wasn't about one gender's mind working differently than the others. It showed up across the study's participants generally, and it points to something real about how uncomfortable, unstructured internal quiet can be for a lot of people, regardless of who they are. When someone has spent years staying busy enough to avoid ever really sitting with their own thoughts, silence stops being restful and starts being the exact condition under which everything they've been outrunning finally catches up. What this produces in a relationship is a person who needs a reason to stay in motion, because stillness isn't neutral for them. It's the doorway back to whatever they've been avoiding. And it's worth being precise about what avoiding actually means here, because it's rarely one dramatic, unresolved thing. More often, it's an accumulation of smaller, unprocessed moments. A worry about money that never got fully worked through, a resentment from an old argument that got shelved instead of resolved, a low hum of anxiety about the future that's easier to outrun than sit with. None of that requires a diagnosis or a dramatic backstory. It's closer to sediment than trauma. Ordinary, accumulated, and uncomfortable to look at directly, which is exactly why staying busy feels so much easier than stopping. The third entry is how that discomfort actually gets discharged. And this is the part that lands directly on a partner. A person who can't sit with their own internal noise won't let external silence exist around them either, because a quiet room with nothing to distract from their own thoughts is an experience they have no tools to manage. So they create something that requires attention. A conversation that didn't need to happen tonight, a concern that's been fine for weeks but suddenly can't wait, a question specifically engineered to pull the other person out of their stillness and into engagement. Picture a couple where the house finally goes quiet after a long day. He's sitting peacefully with a book, and out of nowhere, she brings up something from 3 weeks ago that was never actually urgent. Not because she's trying to start a fight, but because the quiet got uncomfortable, and this was the fastest available exit from it. This isn't usually a conscious decision, it's a reflex. And the person doing it often doesn't fully register what just happened until well after the conversation has already escalated. What this costs the other partner is the exact thing they came home for, taken from them in a moment neither person planned or fully understood in real time. On the ledger, peace converted into noise without either party clocking the transaction as it happens. What makes this especially hard to untangle is that the content of the conversation is often genuinely real. The concern isn't invented out of nothing, it's just been elevated to urgent status by the timing rather than by anything that actually changed about the concern itself. That's part of why this pattern is so easy to miss for years. Everyone involved can point to a real topic and say, well, that was a legitimate thing to discuss, without ever stepping back to notice how reliably these legitimate topics arrive exactly when the house goes quiet. The fourth entry is what this pattern does when it repeats often enough to become the texture of a relationship rather than an occasional bad night. The first time it happens, it's forgettable. Everyone has an off evening. But in a relationship where one partner reliably can't tolerate stillness, this stops being occasional and starts being a recurring tax on the other person's ability to ever fully settle at home. Picture a man who stopped looking forward to quiet evenings altogether, not because he doesn't want them, but because some part of him has learned to expect that stillness is temporary and manufactured conflict is coming the moment it lasts too long. What this costs him is worse than losing individual evenings. It's losing the ability to trust that peace, when it shows up, will be allowed to stay. On the ledger, not just tonight's calm, but the underlying trust that calm is something this relationship can reliably hold. That erosion tends to happen quietly, without a single obvious turning point. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to stop believing in the possibility of a peaceful evening. It's more that the belief gets revised downward, one interrupted evening at a time, until peace probably won't last becomes the default assumption a person carries into every quiet moment, which ironically makes it even harder to actually relax into the stillness when it does show up. The fifth entry is the trap of misreading what's actually happening, which keeps this pattern running longer than it needs to. From the outside, manufactured urgency looks exactly like a real problem. The words used are often genuinely about something, the feelings expressed are often genuinely felt in the moment. That makes it easy for the partner on the receiving end to treat every instance as a legitimate crisis requiring full engagement, which reinforces the exact loop that's draining him, because now external engagement has become the reliable way to interrupt uncomfortable stillness. Picture a man who's learned over years to drop whatever he's doing the instant his partner needs to talk, because refusing feels like withholding, without ever noticing that the pattern of when these conversations arise tracks suspiciously well with how long the house has been quiet, not with how urgent the actual content is. What this costs him is his own ability to tell the difference between a real issue that deserves his full attention and a stillness avoidance reflex wearing the costume of one. The reframe here is to start noticing timing as data, not to dismiss every concern, but to ask honestly whether this particular conversation would have felt this urgent an hour ago, before the quiet set in. That question isn't about catching your partner out. It's about giving yourself permission to respond proportionally instead of at full alarm every single time, which is exhausting for both people regardless of who's actually running the underlying pattern. The sixth entry is naming this pattern without turning it into a weapon, because there's a real risk of overcorrecting here. It's tempting, once you can see this dynamic clearly, to use it as a trump card in every disagreement. You're just avoiding stillness as a way to dismiss anything your partner raises. That's its own kind of dishonesty, and it will read as contempt, which is corrosive to a relationship in its own right. Picture a man who starts reflexively waving off every concern his partner brings up as, "You're just uncomfortable with the quiet," even when she's raising something genuinely worth discussing. What this costs the relationship is trust in the opposite direction. His partner learns that being honest about a real issue gets dismissed as avoidance, so she stops raising real issues too. On the ledger, a diagnostic tool misused into a weapon, which costs exactly the honesty it was supposed to protect. The reframe is to raise this pattern gently and specifically, pointing at the timing and the reflex, not at the person's character. I've noticed this tends to come up right when things get quiet. Is there something underneath that we're not actually getting to? Said that way, it's an invitation into a shared observation rather than a verdict handed down, and the difference in how it lands is enormous. One version opens a conversation, the other one closes it before it starts. The seventh entry is the part that applies just as much to the man watching this as to anyone else. Because stillness intolerance isn't a trait that spares men by default. A lot of men run the exact same avoidance loop through different channels, burying themselves in work past the point it's useful, scrolling a phone for hours instead of sitting with an uncomfortable thought, picking their own version of a fight or a project or a distraction the moment a quiet evening threatens to let something surface. Picture a man who tells this exact story about his partner without ever noticing that he does the identical thing with a different tool. He just calls his version staying productive instead of avoiding stillness. What this costs him is the credibility to ask his partner to do the harder internal work while he's quietly exempting himself from doing his own version of it. On the ledger, a double standard inside a single relationship, which undercuts the entire ask no matter how legitimate the underlying pattern actually is. The reframe is to audit yourself with the same honesty before you ask it of anyone else. If you can spot the pattern in your partner within 30 seconds of this video, but can't spot your own version of it after a full day of thinking about it, that gap is worth noticing on its own. The eighth entry is what actually resolves this, because the pattern doesn't fix itself just by being named once. The only thing that actually works is building an increasing tolerance for sitting with discomfort long enough to find out what's actually underneath it. Not through willpower alone, but through small, repeated practice, a few minutes of real stillness at a time. Extended gradually, sometimes with the support of a therapist who can help make that process less overwhelming, sometimes just through consistent, deliberate practice. Picture a woman who starts with 5 minutes of quiet journaling before reaching for her phone, not to solve everything at once, but to build the muscle of sitting with a thought instead of immediately fleeing it. What this produces over time is a person capable of letting silence exist around them without needing to interrupt it, which means a partner capable of letting the other person actually rest. On the ledger, this is the entry that finally pays out. Internal tolerance, built slowly, that stops requiring anyone else's peace as the price of managing it. It's worth being honest that this is genuinely hard, uncomfortable work with no shortcut. The whole reason avoidance is so common is that avoidance actually does provide immediate relief every single time, while sitting with discomfort provides nothing but discomfort in the short term. The payoff only shows up on a longer timeline, which is exactly why it's so easy to keep choosing the immediate relief over the slower, harder path year after year without ever quite deciding to. The ninth entry is the distinction that keeps this whole framework honest. Not every instance of a partner reaching out during a quiet moment is stillness avoidance, and treating it that way is its own kind of mistake. Sometimes a partner initiating a conversation when things finally go quiet isn't running from her own thoughts at all. She's been waiting all week for a moment when he's actually available to connect, and the quiet evening is simply the first real opening she's had. That's not avoidance. That's a legitimate, unmet need for closeness finally getting an opportunity to surface, and it deserves a completely different response than the pattern described in the earlier entries. Picture a man who's read this whole framework, decides his partner's every attempt at connection during quiet time is just her avoiding stillness, and starts withdrawing from her reasonable bids for closeness under that label. What this costs is worse than the original pattern, because now genuine intimacy is being misdiagnosed and refused. The reframe is to actually check the substance and the pattern over time, not just the timing of a single evening. Does this happen almost every time silence appears, regardless of what's actually going on in the relationship that week? Or is this a specific, occasional need for connection that's been genuinely unmet? One is a pattern worth naming gently. The other is just a partner asking to be with you and deserves to be met, not filed under a diagnosis. Add it all up and here's the full ledger. What this pattern extracts from whichever partner is running it, peace that was supposed to be restorative, convert it into recurring noise. Trust that calm evenings will actually stay calm, the receiving partner's own ability to tell a real issue from an avoidance reflex, and when the pattern gets weaponized instead of named honestly, the very trust it was supposed to protect. Or, misapplied in the other direction, a partner's genuine bid for closeness, wrongly filed away as avoidance and left unmet. What it hands back, if nobody addresses it directly, a relationship where neither person ever really exhales at home. Now here's what you actually do with this, because naming a pattern without a next step is just a more articulate way of staying stuck in it. First, if you recognize this happening to you, name it specifically and calmly rather than absorbing it silently for months. I've noticed the conversations that feel most urgent tend to show up right when things get quiet. Can we talk about what's underneath that lands very differently than resentment that's been building unspoken? Second, if you recognize yourself as the one running this pattern, the honest move is to say so directly rather than waiting for your partner to name it first. I think I struggle to sit still with my own thoughts, and I might be bringing that into our evenings is a genuinely disarming thing to hear. And it opens the door to fixing the actual problem instead of relitigating individual arguments that were never really about their stated topic. It also tends to earn a level of goodwill that waiting to be caught never does. Third, build your own tolerance for stillness deliberately, in small doses, whether or not you think this pattern applies to you. Nobody's fully immune to discomfort with their own thoughts, and the practice benefits every relationship, not just the ones where this shows up obviously. Start with something as small as 5 uninterrupted minutes without a phone in reach, and treat the discomfort you feel as useful information rather than a sign you're doing it wrong. Fourth, audit yourself for your own version of this avoidance before you diagnose it in anyone else. If work, scrolling, or constant productivity is doing for you what manufactured conflict does for someone else, that's the same pattern wearing a more socially acceptable costume. Fifth, protect your own need for peace without treating it as a demand you have to apologize for. Needing an evening where nothing is required of you is not a character flaw, and you're allowed to name it and ask for it directly. And sixth, if naming this pattern repeatedly changes nothing, take that as real information about whether this relationship has the structural capacity to provide what you actually need, not as a reason to give up at the first sign of friction, but as an honest data point worth weighing over time. And seventh, before you diagnose any single evening as avoidance, actually check the pattern over time rather than the moment in isolation. A partner reaching for you during a rare quiet evening might be running from her own thoughts, or she might simply be reaching for you, and mistaking one for the other in either direction costs the relationship something real. None of this is about assigning blame to one side of a relationship. It's about naming a real human pattern clearly enough that it stops running on autopilot for either person. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments. Have you noticed this pattern in your relationship on either side of it? And what did it actually look like the first time you caught it happening? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this is the first place you've heard this named as a mechanism instead of just felt as a frustration, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up, one entry at a time.